Thank you very much. I thank you very, very much, Attila, for that rather kind but marvelously brief introduction. So I thank you for that. And I would just like to say I am very honored and pleased to join you here today, but I'm especially pleased to be here because my dear friend Aaron Pizzi is here, and Aaron Pizzi and I have a rather deep attachment and common view and shared view on some of these issues. And I quite often in speeches describe Aaron Pizzi as my soul sister or my soulmate, because we have discovered a long time ago. In addition to that, we have fought in a few wars. And quite frankly, I'm very pleased to join you here today, Aaron. And I'm really, really ecstatic to see you again. One of the things that Aaron Pizzi did was, and her influence was felt right across North America, was that she brought the fact that violence between intimate partners or violence among family members was an undesirable thing, and it should occupy the minds and the actions of policymakers. Before all of this, you must remember, if you were to do something like to review the old journals on marriage or the old journals on family, you would not find a single mention of the word domestic violence or even violence. So we have, back in the 60s, there was an expression, "You've come a long way, baby." You remember it was an ad for a particular style or kind of cigarette. So we have come a long way, baby. And I think we should admit that. Because when we look at the issues of violence within the family domain, we are looking, and I think his name was Stefan, and I think he did a very brilliant job of showing how fundamental the understanding of this issue is to our humanity and to our very existence. So what we are really dealing with at all times, in a manner of speaking, is the root of many evils, if not all evils. I want to share a few facts with you that, as I was listening to the previous speakers, I found myself thinking, I wish I had brought this piece of information, I wish I had brought this quotation, I wish I had done this, I wish I had done that. But remember, I'm going to drop something on you right now that you may not even know. Some Criminal Code Section 233 on infanticide. I don't know if any of you have ever looked at it, but I spent a lot of time reading the law. And Section 233, which I shall read to you in toto, is a section whose single purpose is to diminish responsibility of mothers who have murdered their children, particularly young children, a year old and younger. And I would like to read it to you. Most people think infanticide means the killing of a child. It means more than that. In legal terms, it is the killing of a child by a female. If a father or a man killed a child like that, it would be first-degree murder. Very few people even think about any of these things. So what you're coming here again is that constant movement at all times, which is always diminishing responsibility on behalf of women. So I'll just say this, read it to you. Section 233, a female person commits infanticide when by willful act or omission she causes the death of her newly born child. If at the time of the act or omission she's not fully recovered from the effects of giving birth to the child, and by reason thereof, or of the effect of lactation consequent on the birth of the child, her mind is then disturbed. Here's a statute which says very clearly, a female person. And if you know a little about statutory interpretation, it means that that cannot mean a male person, because it specifically excludes mention of others. So I just had that with me, and I thought, gee, I should maybe put out such a reminder, because I have been in circumstances when many will say it's not true, it is not possible, but it is true and it is possible. Do you want to say something? Go ahead.
Does that bit of law specify any time frame?
No, but the practice is a year, up to a year old.
Because I remember that there was a really famous photo of a woman breastfeeding her 5-year-old child on the photograph, on the cover of Vogue.
Well, that really wouldn't matter in this case anyway. This is all about a homicide. This is about homicide.
But it says lactation, so conceivably, if the woman is still breastfeeding at 5 years old.
Trust me. The application they use is about a year. Okay, but I just wanted to put that out to you. I think one of the great travesties of the era has been the fact that the phenomenon of violence in the home, violence in the family, or domestic violence was reframed as violence against women. I think that had a rude interruption of the natural progress that the issues were taking, and that treatment was taking as well. And I would go so far as to say that the issue has been falsely framed as violence against women. And I am much happier with IPV, intimate partner violence, or conjugal violence, or couples, or whatever. But I think it's a lot more clear, and I think we understand a lot more. As I was listening to the previous presenters speaking about the actual denial of female, or of aggression by females, and as he pointed out himself, as Dr. Faber himself pointed out, he looked at Chaucer again and was a little surprised at what he saw the wife of Bath saying. And I remember the wife of Bath very clearly in my ancient studies of Chaucer, and she was not nice. So I remember that very clearly. But all kinds of other women spring to mind that are mentioned in literature, particularly creative literature. And I didn't think to bring it with me, but I could have, and I should have perhaps. But I'm thinking of the great tragedy, Medea. And I don't have it with me, but Medea is very angry with her husband, or the significant person in her life, Jason, of Jason and the Golden Fleece fame. And she sets out to hurt him in the best way that she knows how to, which is to kill their children. And somewhere in the body of that play, there's an exchange between her and her maid, as she says to the maid that she is going to hurt him in the way that she knows how to do it, and she knows it will hurt him. She will kill the children. And the maid is pleading with her, please do not do this terrible thing. Please do not. And she seals her maid to silence. And it's something like, you say no more. You say nothing of this. In the name of the race of womanhood, you say nothing. And I should look that up. I have it in speeches somewhere. And I should look that up. And maybe we should re-examine that, because for many years the phenomenon of women killing children as an infanticide was described as the Medea complex. in psychiatric circles. Now, I have no doubt that that may have disappeared into the dustbin of history. I want to share with you some of my experiences, and I do different things from what most of you do here. My business is fighting issues, raising issues on the floor of the Senate, as you know, which is the upper house of the two houses. And I, because of my experience as a central figure in this country in the field of domestic violence and in the business of providing services to women back in the 70s, and because of the reputation that I acquired in the field, standing up for injustice and so on, I attracted the attention of politics and so on. And I actually ran with Mr. Trudeau in 1979 and 1980. But in 1980, I was appointed to the National Parole Board. So in that work, I saw many inmates who were on the other side of the issues, and I saw the tragedies and the terrible consequences that could occur when relations between a man and a woman go very, very, very wrong. And perhaps that is where I can begin today, on the grounds that human beings are very complex creatures and suffer under a very distinct disability that for the most part they have no insights into their own wounded natures or into their own behaviors. And human relationships between men and women are especially complex and difficult. So when the era has layered false concepts on top of a very difficult thing, which is intimacy, it is not really helpful. So when the whole set of ideological notions of the patriarchy have been layered on top of this, it has not been really helpful. And I have quite often described that as a disease in the mind, a mental disease in the mind of the body politic. Because I would submit to you that a relationship between a man and a woman will be difficult and challenging because relationships are that way. It takes work to make them survive. And I have some proof of that because about 3 weeks ago somewhere I was speaking at another place, and a gentleman approached me to thank me for a speech that I had made. It had to be about 30 years ago almost, maybe 25, but not much less, in which he said after hearing me speak, he and his wife went home and had a very serious talk about their relationship. And they sat up for many hours into the night because they were discussing how they didn't like what they were doing to each other and that they had to change. And they made a commitment to change how they spoke to each other, how they expressed anger to each other, and how they would generally relate. And he told me that knowing that I was coming to speak, he had looked up the notes. He still had his notes from the time he heard me speak. And one of the things he said that I had said in the speech was, a relationship between a man and a woman is an undiscovered science, and it's one that you have to discover yourself every time. So I just share this with you to bring this up. So what I have to say really is that I offer my work as a senator, especially on the divorce law, which, like criminal law, has been ravaged by ideological, mean-spirited, and misandrous practices. My perspective is that of balance, fairness, and equilibrium, grounded in the notion that human beings and human relationships are extremely complex, and that intimate family relationships involve personal vulnerabilities, elusive dynamics, and multiple emotions. Managing human relations and human dynamics is challenging even for the well-equipped personality. For the not so well-equipped, managing human relations is daunting and sometimes nearly impossible. Life and human intimacy is a difficult road for many. Human emotions such as love, anger, expectations, and disappointments are driving forces. Human needs and human emotions are compelling. Human complexity is further complicated by the fact that human beings frequently have little or no understanding of what and why they feel, and little or no insight into the effects of their own behavior on those with whom they live. I wish to put on the record here that there's a very famous Jesuit priest called Father Thomas Green, and he produced lots of books for people on retreats who were attempting to personally discern their insufficiencies and their positions in relationships. And in one of his books called Weeds Among the Wheat, he makes a reference to a very great French writer on personal discernment. And his name was Jacques Guillet. And the statement I want to put out to you for your consideration is the following, that we're all working in darkness. And Guillet says, there's the darkness in man himself, who is incapable of seeing his own heart clearly, incapable of grasping completely the seriousness of his actions and the results deriving from them. On observing human behavior, the inescapable conclusion is that human beings, both men and women, are afflicted by their own imperfections, frailties, and woundedness. This condition governs most human behavior. Interestingly, the more imperfect and wounded a person is, the less tolerant that person is of the imperfection and woundedness in others. Human capacity for misunderstanding is great. Men and women are equally capable of vice and virtue. Vice and virtue are human characteristics, not gendered ones. I have politically repudiated the too prevalent notion introduced into the public discourse by radical gender feminist ideology that women are morally superior to men, that men are morally inferior to women, and that somehow men are naturally morally defective. The false proposition of women's inherent virtue and men's inherent vice has dominated and deformed family and criminal law for the last few decades. Much public policy on domestic violence, particularly arrests, charging, and prosecuting policy, has been founded on this deformity, wreaking havoc in the lives of people, most of whom are ill-prepared and ill-equipped to handle such havoc. These policies have bequeathed incalculable pain and suffering and unspeakable tragedy. I just wanted to put that out so that you have an understanding of my moral, spiritual, and legal approach to human problems. And I would encourage all of us here that when we're dealing with these issues, understanding that we're dealing with human issues, and at the end of the day, the best that we can do is to move from a position of fairness and balance and equilibrium, which I think, Erin, is one of the positions that you and I have espoused for many, many years. I would like to say that I'm not an academic. I read a lot. I've always been a reader. It's part of my life, and I do a lot of writing. But I want to share with you my experience of the public interest in these issues. And I have worked on these issues, and I have to tell you, I have experienced fantastic and overwhelming and unmanageable public support on these issues. And remember, I'm at the end of my career now. I'm in the last couple of years of my time in the Senate. But I just want to share with you that I have found that the public, the story that they hear about domestic violence is not the story that they see in their lives. And I would like to recount to you some events that happened in 1995. Some of you here may be a little young to remember that. But I had been invited to speak at an event in Ottawa to government employees on International Women's Day. And I was speaking not really on domestic violence, but in the process of speaking on domestic violence. Now, this is March 8th, 1995. So in the process of speaking to them, I inserted a few unplanned words. I think, Grant, you'll remember this event very well. However, those few words had the effect of challenging the orthodoxy of women's perfection as against men's imperfection. And in mentioning domestic violence, I just used a few words. I said, you know, we should look at the other side of the equation. And then I said, these are the words, quote, behind every abusive husband is an abusive mother. Ooh. Didn't think anything about it. Got challenged by a young ultra-feminist as I walked away, and you can't say that. You can't blame women. You can't do this. Well, I didn't blame anybody. I just know my work. Anyway, I got back, and you'll find this very interesting. I got back to my office, and my secretary, Candace, whom Aaron just met, was eagerly waiting for me to get there. She said, they're calling. Everybody's calling. What did you say? So, of course, I went, what did I say? So the first thing we had to do is retrieve a copy of what I did say. So I took a look at it, and I said, oh, that's perfectly fine. I can live with that. Unknown to me, I had touched a fantastic nerve all across this country. I did about half a dozen interviews and went home and said to my husband, you know, guess what? You know, I said something or the other, and geez, 6 interviews in 3 hours or so. My husband has a very dry sense of humor. He said, oh, must have been a slow day for news. Anyway, great sense of humor. Next morning, my phone was ringing from 5 o'clock, and what I would not have been aware of is that I was the central story on every front page of every newspaper in this country, in every city. You can go back to the record and look them up. And talk shows and these radio programs draw their materials from the newspaper articles. So then, like 5 minutes later, another phone call. So I had 3 interviews lined up, like, you know, 6:30, 7, 7:30. But in the meantime, I called my secretary. I said, I don't know what's happening, but let's get ready. Get into my office. You're going to take every call, and I will accept every interview, and just schedule them 15 minutes apart, beginning at 9 o'clock. And I swear to God, there was a huge public out there who was trying to say, I have seen this. I've been hit by my mother. I was hit by my grandmother. It was like the whole, I don't know, it's like something had burst, and the rivers and the oceans were raging. It turns out I had done an enormous public service without intending to. I didn't set out to do it, but it did happen. And what happened was that there was a national debate going on every radio station in this country, in every single newspaper in this country, all about Senator Cools's remarks. And this is what they were referred to, Senator Cools's remarks. And there was a lot of editorial talk about it, and television, everybody was interviewing everybody else. But I did interviews solidly for about 3 to 4 days. I was exhausted at the end of the 4 days. So what I'm trying to say to you is that in the process of all of this, I began to understand how close I was to the public nerve of the country and how distressed people were nationally at how the debates on violence were being conducted. And so I felt very liberated, and thereafter felt very free to speak very freely about my point of view. But you know, as these journalists are very good and some are very smart, and the reason I'm giving this to you today is because as a result of all of this, I had done 2 big speeches, large speeches, on the Senate on violence. And I actually recorded, so we have some record of these events. And I see Grant smiling, but we have some record, and that's how I met you during that time. But I also have them record, so I just want to record you. These are just a couple that I did put on the record on the Senate floor. We say that all the time, the proceedings or the record. And I'll give you an example. Beginning on March 8th, Toronto CFRB radio station held a survey. Now, they talked for 3 days about Senator Cools's remarks. So during its all-day talk show, they talked about what I had said. But they went farther. They put the question, so they're doing their little polls. CFRB radio station put the question to its listeners, quote, "When you were growing up, which parent was more abusive? Your mother or your father?" I got this from the radio station. Of 200 respondents, 62% said mothers. This is the sort of thing that Dr. Fiebert was talking about. This is the public speaking now, you know. So of 200 respondents, 62% said mothers. 38% said fathers. This is staggering. In Ottawa, CFRA's radio show, The Lowell Green Show, found that 70 to 80% of their callers were agreeing with me. On 9th March 1995, Maclean Hunter Broadcast News placed my remarks before the viewers. You know, you read it. And it says, do you agree? Basically asking them, do you agree? Senator Cool said this. Do you agree? Of the 273 respondents, 57% agreed and 43% disagreed. Though not scientific, these were all the results of public dialogues, as their phones were jammed with people calling up to talk about this thing, as they wanted to talk about childhood experiences in their own homes. One fellow I remember very vividly talking about his mother breaking wooden spoons on his head. One radio station, which I shall not name, they were trying to stay out. They were so afraid of the political correctness or the ideology that they wouldn't have me. They decided they were not going to call me for an interview. They did call, because what was happening was that people were hearing it everywhere and they were intruding into everything else. So they were ignoring what was going on in the rest of the country and talking about something else. And apparently callers were calling and saying, we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about this. You know, and it was an amazing thing. You can imagine a talk show host, people are calling and saying, no, we don't want to talk about, we want to talk about these issues. These are big issues, and so on. Anyway, so that went on for many days, and I got calls from journalists. And I was talking to one beautiful woman from down east, and she said to me, how is it that we have not seen or heard this before? So of course I said to her, well, you know, this is just how it is, but we're seeing it now. I heard from that same woman 3 times in the next 3 weeks. About a week later, she called to say to me that she had read an article about a woman who had thrown a baby out an apartment window. And she was asking me the question, well, obviously this goes on. How come have I never noticed this before? And I kept saying to her, it's the same problem. This is outside of our consciousness. It's right under our noses. And I had lots of calls like that. People asking me, how come they've not noticed this before? And during all of this time, of course, this was all called Senator Cools's remarks. And for the next many months, there was great dialogue and conversations in university classes, but it was always Senator Cools's remarks. It wasn't it wasn't I, the person who's saying this. It was always being repeated. And the fear of people of being pilloried by this unknown persons out there or being destroyed was very impressive. I did my last interview when I decided that was the end. I was tired. No more. No more. I had one particular very ultra feminist ideologue in my office actually interviewing me, and I wanted to say, just please leave my office. But I bit my tongue because that's what she was looking for. But in any event, I came through that, and I think in the great process of all that, I realized I had performed a great public service. And I was approached by countless people. My husband, in those years, wouldn't go to the grocery store with me because there was always somebody approaching me to talk to me about a problem related to either divorce or abuse or something like that. But I would like to share for the psychology and the law involved in it one particular story. About 2 months after 3 months, because this is March, we were into May, I was gardening. I'm a gardener. And I was down on my hands and knees on the front of my lawn, weeding, would you believe? Weeding. So along this woman came, very attractive woman, very good-looking woman, and she looked at me, she recognized, Senator Cools, could I have a chat with you for a moment? So here am I covered in mud up to here. Not a good-looking sight. And I said, just a moment. And she proceeded to tell me that when she heard what I had said, and she'd heard it on the news around noon that day, that she was angry. She was angry at me. She couldn't believe, how could I do this? How could I betray women? It's always about betraying women, you know? How could I betray women? So, of course, I was standing there wondering, why is she telling me all this? Then she went to a very interesting place, a place I didn't think it was going to be, but she did go to that place. She said, Senator Cools, I got home from work that evening about 6 o'clock, and here it comes. She says, and my little boy, my 7-year-old boy, met me at the front door. Listen to this. Met me at the front door, and he did something. And she told me, Senator Cools, I looked up. I knew I was angry. I looked up and flung my hand right next to his ear. So she's been doing this all along. Whether consciously, I can't really verify, but she's saying that she wasn't conscious of it. And she told me that she found her hand right to hit, and then she started to shake. She literally had a semi-breakdown of some kind. And then she said, Senator Cools, you were talking about me. You were talking about me. Senator Cools, I thank you. I will never raise my hand at my child again. So when people give you those kinds of responses, it means that something very deep and profound has happened in their lives as a result of this incident. So I just wanted to share that with you because my position is very well known across this country. And I have traveled the width and the breadth of this country and dealing with all kinds of terrible issues because the situation continues to develop. During the process, what began to go on in this country in a very massive way is what we call false accusations of abuse within civil proceedings. You must understand, accusations of this nature are of a criminal type, mens rea, and all the standards of proof. But these were being raised in the context of civil proceedings and divorce because it became a technique a fast track to spousal support, child support, and everything else. And Vern, you'll remember a lot of this. And there were men who were being destroyed ruthlessly and mercilessly in this country by an accusation. I want to tell you, if you know anything about parents and parents who love their children, any such charge or accusation against a parent, especially a father, will bring him to his knees. You know, and I would see big, strong men crying like children. I remember meeting with one in particular. He came with his mother, his daughter, the one he was supposed to have hurt, and his new girlfriend, all pleading, please. And I was getting 120 handwritten letters a day. So I just wanted, that's where I got to know Grant and a few other people, and Vern Beck as well. And you also have to know this was a wide movement as well, because a wide issue, because at that time you also had the flourishing of all of these unusual syndromes, which all were having the effect of diminishing women's responsibility. You had the what was it, the Swengeli, you remember? Help me with this, man. We had the Swengeli influence. We had, there are others, PMS syndrome, battered women syndrome, that was the big one, recovered memory syndrome. Now, the psychiatrists helped a lot to really put that one to rest. And one of the lead psychiatrists was a very able fellow named Dr. Mirsky. So, because the industry and the discipline of psychiatry was being challenged, because they were reviewing, really revamping the whole notions of depression and repression and dissociation. But in any event, so this went on, but it got a few blows. It got a few blows. So I just wanted to say that, and even the term battered women's syndrome, we don't know what that is. It's not a diagnosis. There's no therapy for it. The term comes from a book that was written by a particular person, and the entire book doesn't have a single reference. Somebody just pulled this out of their head, and it sounded good, and people were using the term as if it was significant, but it was all a fantasy, a creation, a fabrication, an artificial construct. So I'm just putting that out to you. There's other stuff that I want to share with you so that you understand the era. And I had men all over the country, people, families, they were coming from women to, on behalf of their sons, on behalf of their fathers. I recorded on the floor of the Senate, I can send you those speeches if you'd be interested in, 52 instances of cases where men were wrongly and falsely accused within these contexts. And I have the judges saying that, the judges basically saying that this was falsified, this was a malicious thing to do, and so on. But, you know, the orthodoxy has its friends in high places. So, as a result, the departments didn't do that very much about it. But by the mere fact of raising it on the floor of the House and recording them, it did have a huge effect. And the number of false accusations, of cases that I was hearing about, just kept getting less and less and less. But in those days, I just want to tell you, I'm just trying to show you this deranged thing that took hold of human beings, where every single man was suspicious, was suspected. So any man who was seen now holding his little girl, his little daughter, in a loving way, was being viewed as, is he an abuser? Endless, this sort of thing. I want to share with you a study that was bankrolled, that was funded by the government of Canada in 1990. It cost many millions of dollars, and it was called the Canadian Panel on Violence Against Women. So nobody's interested in, violence, say, for example, between women and children. None of that, just violence against women. Remember, as I said, the issue was falsely framed. So this you'll find very interesting. You review, and at the time I did, its 1993 report was named Changing the Landscape, Ending Violence. Part 1, listen to the language of the headings. Part 1 was called The Context. Chapter 1 was entitled The Feminist Lens. Chapter 1 also contained a section called Looking Through a Feminist Lens. Another section was called Patriarchy and Violence, while another was entitled Heterosexism. Have you ever heard that word? Heterosexism. Just make it up. Hetero, right? Make it up. And this is the whole thing about a lot of this stuff. It was just pulled out of somebody's imagination. This report informed that the concept of patriarchy was essential to the panel's analysis of the nature of gender inequality and violence against women. You have to know, when I was reading all this, I had great difficulty keeping a straight face, but it's a serious matter. So anyways, they're saying again, the concept of patriarchy is essential to the panel's analysis of the nature of gender inequality and violence against women. Then they explain patriarchy. Thus, I quote, patriarchy is not just a central concept in feminist analysis. For many women, it is also a daily reality. The most violent and profound expression of patriarchal power sits at their dinner tables every evening and sleeps in their beds at night. This is not a private opinion. This is a report financed by the Government of Canada. So the report described heterosexism, quote, heterosexism is the assumption that a woman's life will be organized around and defined in relation to a man. The report also told us that Canadian society is organized around compulsory heterosexuality, and that heterosexism is embedded in all state institutions, that women are likely to call upon the police, the justice system, and religious institutions. Colleagues, sorry, I'm not going to say it. Friends, these concepts had more to do with constructing an ideological framework and nothing to do with assisting families in crisis or individuals who have been afflicted by family violence. Because somewhere in all of this, the ideology takes over and becomes the end in itself. In any event, by that time I had been distancing myself from all that sort of thing. But I will say again, it's a terrible thing when all human behavior is being judged by an artificial, even fictitious construct, such as men's power and control over women. And I really believe that this has created so much injustice. In any event, I think I can stop there for the time being and take some questions. And just to let you know, I'm just an old warrior at the end of my career. Go ahead.
I imagine that this response would be quite involved, but what happened for the sake of the children?
Well, nothing. Nothing. So you know about that. So I didn't realize you knew that so well. In 1996, I also met, until 1997, a bill came before the Senate to, I don't know, you know, but bills have to, they begin the House of Commons, most of them, if they're government bills, and then they have to get 3 readings there. They have to come to the Senate for 3 readings. So when we got that bill, it was an amendment to the Divorce Act. You have to understand there were great reforms in the Divorce Act that was introduced by the then Minister Mark McGuigan in 1984. Liberals were defeated. In came a new government, new Justice Minister Crosby, under Mulroney, and they did a few changes in the act, but they basically the same. But that act introduced 3 things into the Divorce Act of Canada, which hadn't been amended since 1968, when it was the very first Divorce Act. So their bills had something, a clause in it, which said that both men, fathers and mothers, owe children a duty of child support in accordance with their means. It also had another clause in it, basically upholding the fact that children should have maximum access to both parents and families. One of those is still in the modern act. We call it the friendly parent rule. And then there's a third thing which was introduced. A term was introduced into the act, the best interests of the child, which had been introduced. So the 1986 Act has all of that. So in 1996 now, they brought this act, and if anybody knows how to read law, you can see very clearly that somebody somewhere is going after the great reforms of the 80s, which was equality between men and women in respect of paying child support, and equality between families in respect of visitation and access and so on. And what that bill was doing was creating a whole new scheme where the pair of child support is a non-custodial parent, usually fathers, usually men, and it would be done in accordance with a grid. You'd have to know how bizarre this is, and this is where one of these days, Attila, we should do a session on parliamentary process, because what they were doing is using a process called regulations. So they introduced a clause, they were deleting that both men and women, fathers and mothers, owe the child support. They were repealing that section, and they were introducing, by regulations, a set of guidelines with tables, which would dictate the amount of monies. So if a man was making, a non-custodial parent, you got to get the language right? The non-custodial parent was making $10,000 a year. This is the amount in child support that would have to be paid. So I picked up on this very quickly in my reading of the bill, and it just so happens that the then conservative, the guy on for the other side, who was then opposition, because this is liberals in power now, right? The opposition in the Senate, a very nice man named Senator Jessamine, who saw life as the way I was seeing it. So he and I did it. So what we did was we began to object very strongly in the committee, and we tried to amend the bill in the committee. What the government did was that they blocked us. And we said, well, they're not going to amend, we're going to defeat. Remember, you have to know how the process works. Committee are 7 government members, supporters, 5. 1 person on the government side, by voting with the opposition, we can take out a bill. A tie vote in the Senate is a defeat. We were going to take that bill right out. We were going to defeat it. So we said, oh, you're not going to give us any amendments, because we started to make the amendments, you know. We amend this, we amend that. No, no. So then we said, oh, really? Well, we're going to defeat the whole bill. And at that point, they used a not really proper technique to stop the meeting. So the meeting was arrested, and everything was in abeyance. And at that point, the journalists were hearing all upstairs, everywhere, just the room was filling up with them. Hi, Walter. I'm talking about Bill C-41, and Walter here came as a witness on that bill. They were hearing up there that the Senate was about to defeat a bill in committee, so the room was filling up and so on and so forth. The end of that process was that we got a committee. The government gave, because they weren't going to get the bill out of the committee again, the government made a huge step and made a commitment to us that they accepted some of our amendments. That's where that 40% time comes from. That 40% thing that's still in the guidelines and so on. That's where that comes from. We were trying to give fathers a fighting chance. And but out of all of that, they agreed that they would support a joint committee of the Senate and the House of Commons on the issue of child access and custody in divorce. And that was a big victory in itself. But the bigger victory was the public response to that committee. And that's when you were in Canada. It was during that committee. And that committee heard 500 witnesses all across the country. And you know, you're out west, and then there are ways, there are patterns that they do these kinds of things. And I tell you, it was a big fight. It was a big fight, and I never missed a meeting because I dared not miss a meeting. But at the end of that, we got that report for the sake of the children. We carried, when I say we, our opinion carried the day, and the report was people were well waiting for it. It was well covered. It was a huge issue in the public mind, and all the opinion polls were showing that fathers were getting a rough ride in divorce, and it was an amazing thing, and that's when you discover that real spirit of justice that lives inside of human beings. That if you can manage to tap into it, you know, and you just release it, it will speak, and it will speak fearlessly. So anyway, but nothing has happened on the report. If you remember, the then Justice Minister, when she responded in 6 months later, this would be in 1999 now, she just said, well, they will bump the response for another few years when they could get a report on how the child support guidelines were working. Well, a minister can't really postpone consideration of an issue beyond her watch. You see? So that's what's happened to that, nothing. However, the real result of all of that is that the courts and the whole system made a huge step in how they were dealing with these issues. And Walter will talk about some of those things, I hope, because it was a great experience for us all. And
you were magnificent.
It was hard, though. It was very hard. But I wanted to tell you, justice was done in that report. Justice was done, and the expectations were very, very high, and so on. But there has been a sea change on the ground. There's still problems, and big problems, but nothing. Like I haven't had anybody writing to me with sending me their case law and the judgments in their cases, where every day I was getting 3 or 4. That doesn't happen anymore. And also, too, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, the courts, life is a lot fairer, because I got lots of phone calls. I would get I get tons of them. But I remember one lawyer calling me up from another jurisdiction to say to me that he had had a case and the father was having a tough time, and he began before the judge to explain the father's situation and the needs of children. The judge cut him off short. He says, I don't think you have to waste your time, you know, to explain. He says, isn't this what we're here for? Aren't we here to decide the best interests of the child so that the child can be a child and both parents can be good parents? Isn't that what we're here for? And my friend said he knew he was going to win that day. So in any way, nothing has happened on it. But I'm at the end of my career, and I have just for the sake of the record, introduced a bill for shared parenting. It's a simple bill, so 2 or 3 clauses, and it's very clean in how it casts. We cast it in a very good way. And I don't know if any of you know it here, but the term "the best interest of the child" was born of the Lord Chancellor's courts in England called the Courts of Equity, which had a special jurisdiction to look after children. And it all came out of the days when knights fought for the king, and the knights would leave these orphan children with huge estates, with huge estates, and these children would be looked after, and they very sophisticated system. At some point in time, those children grew up and took over the control of those lands. But remember the 19th century, beginning about 1689, but through the 1700s, right up to about 1850, is the greatest period of social liberation and emancipation probably in the history of humanity. And in those years, you were finding terms coming into existence like the welfare of the child, the interests of the child, as they were making decisions that were showing that the child is a separate entity and a separate being from the parent, from either parent, and with a set of interests and needs that have to be attended to, and really, in fact, upholding the fact that we are the guardians of these little persons, these little people. So nothing has happened, but, and I am not sure that in the current era we could do what we did then. But that's neither here nor there. Any other questions? It's a vast area. But we must learn more about process and how this works, because the fact of the matter is that there were so many requests from fathers and fathers, mothers, and grown children to appear before that committee that it was unmanageable. And I don't know if you know anything about how parliamentary committees function, but usually you walk into a hotel and there's a table and there's a hearing a witness and maybe 3-4 witnesses waiting, but the room is empty. During those cross-country hearings, those rooms were packed every day. Packed, you know, no room, just packed. And any morning on those committees, I had about 30 people lined up hoping to join me for breakfast. That was how high the public interest was. And you would see these fathers coming in with their mothers. It was a very beautiful thing to watch.
And that was a special committee?
It was a special committee of both houses, yes. But one of these days, if we have a meeting on parliamentary process, I could tell you a little bit more.
And for anybody who's interested, the transcripts can be accessed through Google. Just to sit
Or you just go on. I still have some spare copies. I get lots of requests for copies of that report. I can send you. I believe I still have a couple of bound volumes.
It's downloadable from the Canadian Children's Rights Council website.
So you still got it up?
Oh, we get thousands of people a day coming there.
I'm so impressed,
In
Grant.
150
Thanks.
countries.
Well, it traveled a lot because some years back, a woman actually, I think she was the leader of the government in Australia, in the Senate. I went down to New York to meet with her because she wanted to discuss that report with me. So it's out there, but I don't see this government doing that much too soon, but we'll see. We'll see. Don't forget, at their conventions, there was a big motion for shared parenting, I think back in 2005. So that's still on the record there.
Senator, I'm just wondering how your timing is.
Beg pardon?
I'm just wondering how your timing is.
Well, my time is that I want this woman to speak.
Sure.
But I'm cool, if she's
One
okay.
question here, I believe.
Go ahead.
I would just.
I hope, though, you understand what I've been trying to put before you. Because it was tough.
I understand.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, if you could confirm this, debtor's prison has been outlawed in Canada for
Long
quite some
ago.
time. Now, can you explain to me how fathers who lose their job are still being tossed in debtor's prison, for lack of a better word? What is the law that's enforcing that?
There's no law.
Walter would like to speak to that.
That Walter speaks for that. There is no law.
Okay, here's how the game is played.
There's no law.
The Family Responsibility Office is a provincial agency. It can't do anything, and it can't interfere with a superior court judgment. So the judgment is achieved in the superior court. Father loses his job. He's got to pay $100 a month. I'm just picking a number out of thin air. He wants to get back into court to tell the judge he's lost his job. Mother's lawyer knows this game well. Mother's lawyer's job now is to keep father out of court. So there's an adjournment and somebody is sick and the documentation isn't correct. And this goes on month after month. A father is falling consistently behind. The FRO comes into the picture and says, you're $1,000 in arrears, you're 10 months behind. We're going to take your driver's license. If he had any chance to get a job, it's now completely gone. 6 months after that, actually I'm not saying this correctly, they start with his fishing license, then they take his driver's license.
And passport.
And passport, eventually they put him in jail. All right? That's because he can't get back into the superior court to amend the order. The FRO judge is not interested in whether he has a job or doesn't have a job, whether he can walk or talk or not walk or talk. They have a superior court order and they will enforce it. Now, I happen to be a criminal lawyer, not a family lawyer. I very often see men who are in this situation. And the amazing thing that happens is after they've been put in jail for 90 days, you can't threaten them anymore because they end up with other guys just like them.
Tons.
They're not in with the drug dealers. They're not in with the murderers. They're not even in with the petty thieves. They're in with other guys just like them. So while it's a real pain for them and this notion of going to jail brings with it such a stigma, they realize that this is just how it works. So I'm not saying it's a good thing in any way. But there's another part to this. The fact that you can't change a superior court order and you can't get in, what happens if, God forbid, the children die? Does dad go back to the superior court and say, let's get rid of this order? Now, FRO has a statistic rolling over every month. Yes. He's not making payments. Mother's bereaved. She doesn't want the payments. And the numbers keep rolling. Or, God forbid, mother dies and father gets custody. And he's got the kids living with him, and this number is rolling over every month. And so the FRO annually comes out with some massive statistic about there's a massive amount of money owing, and part of it is just fraud, doesn't exist, it could never be enforced. Okay, so that's a little that I know. Now, does anybody else have a question or want to speak? I just walked in here. I'm sorry, I've come from work. But I was involved with the senator on the Just for the Children report. A friend of mine who was invited to an event where the senator was speaking, and I encouraged him to go hear her. And he came back and he said, man, she is fierce. And there's no other word to describe her. If there's a word beyond fierce, she's the fiercest, fiercer, that's her. What she did during the course of that was absolutely stunning, that whole hearing.
Because I'm well aware of Paul Donovan's story.
I don't know Donovan's story at all.
He was a trucker. He was laid off in 2008. First thing they did,
they suspended his license. He was a trucker. How is he supposed to make amends? Next thing they did, they threatened to throw him in jail. The third thing they did, after they threatened to throw him in jail, he said, "That's it, I've had enough," and he rolled himself underneath the train. August 30th, I believe it was, 2010 in London, Ontario.
It's really ironic for a criminal lawyer. I've devoted my whole career to keeping people out of jail. But the guys who go come back and say, hey, it wasn't all that bad, and I don't have a criminal record. It's just trying to enforce a bill. It's a debtor's prison. So
they would say, the government would say it's not. But what Walter showed you is that a strange interface between federal jurisdiction and provincial jurisdiction. But it's very unfair. And I'll give you an example. You know, governments have engaged in creating this apparatus to get money out of men's hands for child support. But there's no equivalent structure on the questions of access.
The access legislation...
There's no equivalent structure. So the entire coercive power, state power, is behind the child support mechanism, but it doesn't go, it avoids the access issue.
The FRO predecessor legislation in Ontario contained enforcement powers for access. The legislation was passed, but they never proclaimed those sections that provided for enforcement. But let me talk a little bit of, does anybody mind if I talk about the report, the For the Children?
I'd
Go
just
ahead.
like to toss in one thing. So the Attorney
And I want to talk
General
about
of Ontario,
suicides.
Garrison, has not signed into
No.
full force and effect
No.
and proclaimed.
No, this
or
was-
actually, the Governor General. Sorry,
This
my bad.
was 20 years ago.
20 years ago.
Right, that legislation existed. But let me go back to some stories about the report for the children. Alan Rock was the then Attorney General, and he was caught in a bind. They needed to get the taxing power, the reversal, taxing child support in the hands of the payer, because the government was in deep financial trouble, and they had targeted a date in May of a particular year.
Maybe you should explain that, how they reversed, they were altering the taxing structure on child support.
For 60 or 70 years at least, since they had invented income tax in Canada, child support was always taxed in the hands of the recipient.
And the lower income, the lower earner.
Generally speaking, it was the mother, and generally speaking, she didn't work. So it was a tax break for the family.
Yes.
If there was, let's say, 30 cents payable by father on $1, the father had earned $1 and had to pay 30-cent tax. If he gave it to mother, pursuant to a court order, and she had no other income, she'd only have to pay 15 cents on that dollar. And so it was designed as a tax break. Well, the feminist wave hit with all of the insanities that flowed from it, and they decided it was unfair to tax the mothers. Let's tax the fathers, and let's give the government 30 cents on every dollar as opposed to 15 cents on every dollar.
Right.
So they were going to change this. And to hide that and to cover it, they came up with the child support guidelines. We're going to have child support guidelines, and then fathers will have to pay the tax on the money all at the same time. Was worth at that time $500 million or
It was a lot of money that
huge amount
that they
of money.
took out of divorced families' pockets.
So I now am going to appear before the committee. I did my appearance, but I happened to be at the Supreme Court of Canada on a piece of litigation. So I dropped in one day. And who do I see but Alan Rock appearing before the committee? And I grew up in downtown Toronto, and I've practiced in Toronto since 1967. I well know who Alan Rock was. He was a corporate commercial litigator at one of the major downtown firms. And Alan Rock is before the committee, and he says, you know, I'm a family lawyer, so I know about these things, which, of course, no part of that was accurate or reliable. That same day, was it Ross Finney?
The guy, yeah.
Ross
he was
Finney
the academic.
was the bureaucrat who had assisted.
No, he was an academic who had helped them to
Yes.
design them. Yeah.
Okay, he wasn't quite a bureaucrat. He'd helped design the child support guidelines, and he'd resigned because of the dishonest structure in them. Brian Jenkins, who some of you may know, who was an actuary, was able to get out of the child support guidelines that it wasn't pure child support. It involved spousal support as well. There was a portion of it that's spousal support. I'm going to say one more thing and then I'll sit down. You may not remember, Senator, but in Toronto, when we appeared before the Joint Committee, the feminists refused to appear in the same room with the fathers. This was all part of a smear to allege that men were violent. And so it went in two different flights. The men were in the morning and the women were in the afternoon, or vice versa. And we're starting to see this kind of craziness rear its head. There again, there's a woman who writes for the Globe, and she did one of the standard feminist articles. There's just been so many of them for so long that they're boring, but it's the same theme. The theme was this kid in Santa Barbara goes nuts, kills 3 men and 2 women, and says something. 4 women?
4 men.
4 men and 2 women.
And,
Okay.
and he suicided himself.
And he suicided himself.
5.
But there's something in his letter about how he's been rejected by women, right? And Trache will know all about this story. Do you know what I'm talking about? So this woman writes a column in the Globe saying, well, he didn't like women, so all men are responsible for this. All men are in on that. And that smear, that gigantic smear against men is now rearing its head. I'm sorry I may have spoken too long.
And there's another part to the story, and that is that Anne McClellan, the Justice Minister, after the report came out, stalled this for the Liberals, where she then decided to have consultations with stakeholder groups, where we all went to the hotel. There was a bomb threat, and only men were attending these because the feminists refused to sit in the same rooms. The stakeholder feminists refused to sit in the same rooms as the men. So down at the Sheridan Center across from the Toronto City Hall, we were all escorted down to the lobby because there was a bomb threat. We were escorted to another part of the building to continue those meetings.
Yes,
the
well.
feminists were in the national media saying we will not go to these stakeholder meetings and go participate in these consultations put on by the Justice Minister Anne McClellan, and the whole thing was a menu of things that she would like us to choose from, which weren't even relevant to the report.
Thank you.
So I'm going to wind up now.
Okay, super.
I just want my last thing, just to respond to 2 things. We have no concept of the number of men in that 15-year period who were wrongfully convicted and served in prison on false accusation. We have no concept. We know there are many. Divorce-related suicides, an enormous amount. But I have no idea of an exact number. I have evidence of individual cases, but I've never been able to say this percentage of them, except that there were many. And I want you to know there's something about a parent, a father, mother, but a parent losing their child that will create more despair in the human heart than any of us could imagine. So the suicides, wrong. I want to close with one voice from one judge in a case of a wrongful prosecution. And this is a case, is out in Alberta. I won't bother to give the name because I really want to pass the floor on. But it's a case of a wife who had brought charges against a husband of abuse. And I just want to read the judge's words about the particular case. Okay, I'll read as follows. He's talking, apparently when this man was arrested, he had an alibi, but the alibi was never looked into. that he says, quote, the judge says, quote, "I'm advised the alibi was formally disclosed to the Crown. It was also disclosed to the police officer immediately being told of the allegations. The officer chose not to investigate the alibi and instead just laid the charge. Apparently he didn't feel he had any responsibility to do so." Continues, "I want to make two further comments, because one is curious as to how a man could be falsely accused in these circumstances right up to and including a trial. The reasons are quite clear to me and disturbing. First, the police apparently have a policy of zero tolerance in domestic assault cases. Any zero tolerance policy is dangerous. It is especially dangerous when it is not properly applied." So there's one judicial person expressing concern of this on this policy, and there are many. If you take, but you know, it's a huge big job reading through judgments and extracting what you need. In any event, that is my small contribution to this matter. And if any of you are interested in doing further study on this, believe me, I have copious files and copious documents. Matter of fact, I have no place to keep them anymore. I'm running out of space, so I'm looking to unload some.
Senator,
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Oh yes, it was a labor of love.
Thank you.
You can only be that committed to an issue and work that hard if you really believe in human justice and in the importance of a child being involved with both of its parents. And I think the previous speakers have shown the huge damage that is done to children in those early years. So he justified me in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. That was one incredible presentation. I'm so thankful that you